Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox with the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. We are on episode 22, and today I'm extraordinarily pleased to have my good friend and colleague Matt Ellis to visit with us about the recent public announcements about the FCPA investigation into the Brazilian company Embraer. Although this investigation has been going on for some time, and it's certainly been in the public record about at least the ongoing nature of the investigation, we recently had some disclosures made which, if not changed the course of the investigation, were certainly interesting for the compliance practitioner. The Wall Street Journal reported that the relevant Brazilian regulatory authorities had requested documents or at least assistance from the U.S. Department of Justice indicating that they were involved in an investigation of some type. And we also had allegations of at least one bribe paid in the Dominican Republic to secure sales contracts. So we had some specificity regarding the bribery amount and schemes, and also we've had the entry of the Brazilian regulatory authorities. It was unclear to me if it was the new Brazilian anti-corruption law or just a currently existing domestic anti-corruption and anti-bribery laws. Nevertheless, whenever we have a foreign jurisdiction investigating along with the Department of Justice or even following, that's certainly significant for a wide range of companies, Brazilian companies, but also U.S. companies who may be doing business in Brazil. So, as always, when I have a question on all things Brazil / South America / Latin America / anywhere south of Texas, I call up my good friend Matt Ellis, and I'm lucky enough today to be visiting with him. So, Matt, could you tell us what you know from the public record and what you think the significance of some of these things might be?
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, again for this opportunity to join you. And I love what you're doing. I can't believe you're already on episode 22. Is that right?
Right.
So congratulations on all of the developments. And it's it's a real pleasure to be able to discuss the Embraer investigation. This is it's such a key development in Latin America for so many reasons, which we can discuss in the next few minutes. But I guess the one way to start is to talk about why this matter, has a personal significance to me. November 3rd, 2011 was when Embraer announced to the world that it was under investigation for potential FCPA violations. This was a month after I launched the FCPA Americas blog. So I was just, 10 posts in at that time. And it was one of, Embraer's announcements was one of those developments that really shocks the world, or at least my world, with respect to anti-corruption developments in the region. And so back then we knew very little. We knew that the company had received a subpoena from the SEC. As you know, this suggests that it was not a voluntary disclosure. It suggests that U.S. authorities obtained information of possible wrongdoing and then sought to uncover more information by sending a request to Embraer. You and I both know what those subpoenas look like. I mean, I like to say the first two questions on those subpoenas are usually, first, who was in charge at the time, right? In this case, who was in charge in the 2008-2009 period. Authorities want to know, who to focus on in terms of ultimate responsibility. And then the second question that we always find in these subpoenas is, send us a copy of all of your compliance program, and policy and ethics materials that were in place at the time. They want to know if there was a framework in place at the time. And these are just a couple of reasons, again, of why it's so important for companies to make, the basic investment and compliance programs before a big issue like this arises.
Matt, let me stop you right there because I think most of our listeners know that I try to be the nuts and bolts guy. I try to help companies implement or enhance compliance solutions. But one thing I don't do is I don't get involved in investigations. You, however, both help companies implement and enhance compliance solutions and help companies in investigation. And I'm not sure our listeners really understand the the difference in that, but more importantly, what is your background that really gives you the ability to understand how to think through an investigation?
Well, I had the opportunity to work early on and really cut my teeth with a very high-level FCPA investigations practice, which is Miller and Chevalier. We were working, you know, in the mid 90s, before the escalation in FCPA enforcement actions in 07, 08. We were working on some of the largest matters then, and worked with companies on settlement agreements with the government. And given my language skills, I was sent to a lot of places throughout Latin America. Then I went to the World Bank and conducted investigations for the bank, more on the enforcement side, for 2 years, and spent most of my time in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And then I'm back affiliated with Miller and Chevalier now, and so continuing to work on investigations. So that's an overview of some of my work with investigations.
Okay, well, let's get back to Embraer and 2011, what you were able to glean in and maybe bring us forward.
Yeah, and so at that point, the big question for a lot of folks in the region was, how can this be? How can it be that the United States government is investigating a Latin American company for potential improper payments in other countries? It just doesn't make much sense, right? And so, and I've done a lot of research on this. I've spoken to a lot of folks, and I think this is the first FCPA investigation against a major Latin American-based multinational. I think that's the case. I haven't found any evidence to the contrary. Right. And if any of your viewers knows of another matter, please, inform me or inform you, because I'd like to know. But because of that, it's really been a wake-up call to boardrooms throughout the region. How can this be? And the answer to that question is, as you know, the jurisdictional reach of the SEC and the Department of Justice can be very broad. For companies, even non-U.S. companies that are listed in the United States, they are subject to the accounting provisions of the FCPA. And for companies with operations in the United States, they can be subject to the anti-bribery provisions of the FCPA as well. And what we've learned from these recent reports is that it appears that there's an additional jurisdictional link. The bribery payments associated with this Dominican Republic deal flowed through the United States, which gives U.S. authorities another way of asserting jurisdiction over activities like this.
That's very interesting, perhaps very troubling for defending such a case if you have actual bribery conduct flowing through the United States, either in terms of specific conduct or even the money trail.
Definitely. So what else do we know? Well, we know that at least 3 countries are involved outside of Brazil, right? So payments under investigation relate to 3 different countries. At first, we didn't know what countries those were. Then reports started to come out indicating that one of those countries is Argentina. And the potential area of focus there were contracts valued at $900 million for the sale of 22 commercial aircraft to Aerolíneas Argentinas, which is the government-controlled airline company in Argentina. That issue brings up a lot of issues. Officials of an airline company being considered foreign officials for purposes of the FCPA if that company is controlled by a foreign government. That amount, $900 million, is considerable. We still don't know many details with respect to that transaction, but that's what we know now. What we've learned recently, and this has really come from reports in the Wall Street Journal that appear to be credible, and the reason they appear to be credible is because they are based on an actual review of mutual assistance requests that were submitted from the Brazilian government to U.S. authorities in February of this year. And what those documents show is that country number 2 is the Dominican Republic. What we know about the transaction under review there is that it involved a contract valued at $90 million for the sale of 8 fighter attack jets, not jets, I'm sorry, I think they're turboprop airlines, manufactured by Embraer to the Dominican Republic military. The apparent kickback in return for that $90 million contract was a $3.4 million kickback back to the director of special, I think his title was Special Operations, or Special Projects, the director of Special Projects for the Dominican military. So those are, we know 2 out of the 3 countries. There's speculation as to the third, but there have been no solid reports yet.
It sounds like Embraer really is in the midst of a very all-encompassing investigation, and I'm not sure the dreaded where else question has been asked recently. It may have been asked a long time ago, but if there are allegations of bribes paid in Argentina and the Dominican Republic, the Department of Justice may certainly want a worldwide comprehensive review of Embraer's sales agents, representatives, any kind of compliance program they had in place. Have you had any experience where one of those investigations just mushroomed or expanded way beyond what the initial allegations were?
Well, yeah, and that's I mean, this is another reason why this case is so interesting for the region, because you have, again, executives at other large companies based in Latin America that are looking at this case and asking questions. And what they're seeing is, look, the company received the subpoena in 2010. It reported on November 3rd, 2011 that it was conducting an internal investigation and that it was under review by the U.S. authorities. Here we are 2 years after that, 2013, 3 years after the subpoena arrived, and the company is still conducting this investigation. So what it's causing some of my clients and certainly other executives throughout the region to say is, how can this be, right? How can an internal investigation last for 3 years? And, my answer is, well, the way these things work is, you have an initial allegation, and the company, is asked to or decides to conduct an internal review of that allegation. That allegation might have to do with one country, right? But unless you have a compliance program in place, when you go back to the authorities are going to ask you, well, how do we know that those same issues are not occurring in other countries as well? How do we know that this isn't a systemic problem and not an isolated problem in your company? Now, as you know, if your company has a compliance program in place, you can answer that question pretty easily, right? You can say, look, we've conducted audits of our other divisions and our other, regular compliance audits. Look, we have standard due diligence of third parties and monitoring of those third parties. Look, we've trained our folks and we've sent a strong tone from the top and we have a hotline in place. You can go down the list and show all of your compliant practices, and because of that you can say, look, we are pretty certain that this is an isolated event. Now, if you don't have a compliance program in place, it's much harder to give those assurances. And that's where it then becomes necessary to go and look, right? Go to the Dominican Republic, and go to Israel, and go to Asia, and go to other parts of the world, and look at your operations there and try to get an understanding of whether these issues are larger than you might have initially expected.
And I'd like to now turn to the Brazilian regulator's request for information, assistance, documentation. In my experience, that's certainly the first time I've seen a public announcement that the Brazilian regulators have asked for that type of assistance from the Department of Justice. What are your thoughts on that?
Wow, this is such a huge aspect of this whole picture, right? Because the landscape now has changed, right? Before, there was a lot of talk, but now the landscape has changed. If you're a company from the United States or from another part of the world and you're operating in Brazil, no longer do you have to concern yourself strictly with the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. All of a sudden, Brazil laws apply and are being enforced. So let's back up a little bit. As we all know, and there's been a lot of fanfare, we've written a lot on our blog about the new Brazilian anti-bribery law. What's so innovative about this law is for the first time it applies corporate liability, both civil and administrative in nature, for bribery offenses. Before this, there was liability for such offenses, but it was limited to individual liability. The government could go after the individual for paying the bribe, but not hold the company responsible. Now that has changed. But the law doesn't come into force until January 2014. We still have a couple of months till it comes into force. So, and it does not apply retroactively. So to these allegations of wrongdoing by Embraer, the new law does not apply. The point is, though, that if authorities now are willing to apply individual liability to these offenses, you can be sure that authorities will be seeking to exercise the new corporate liability provisions once they come into force. So that's one important point. What we are seeing is that Brazil is not waiting, it's stepping up and it's applying individual liability and it's requesting information. And what's so interesting about this mutual legal assistance request from the government of Brazil is that usually we see these requests go in the other direction. We see U.S. authorities exercising these provisions of treaties like the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption to request information from Latin American countries, maybe Mexico, maybe Colombia, regarding one of the United States government's investigations. Now we see the scenario flipped. We see the Brazilians seeking information from U.S. authorities on its investigation, which we know has been ongoing now since 2010. Not only that, but we see the U.S. authorities responding. The Wall Street Journal reports that U.S. authorities have agreed to cooperate and are providing information. So again, what I want to underscore here is that the landscape is changing, it's changing quickly, and it's changing in a dramatic way.
Are there any things that either a Brazilian company or a non-Brazilian company, are there lessons that they need to learn from this or lessons to be drawn from them?
So maybe we ask the question in this way. If Embraer had, and we still don't know if it had a robust compliance program in place back in 2009. We're assuming that it doesn't, given that we're now in 2013 and the investigation continues. If it had a program in place at that time, what would have happened? Well, there's a good chance, a good probability that Embraer wouldn't be in the position it is in right now. How do we know that? Well, you've discussed, quite often the Morgan Stanley declination, right? We have specific evidence from U.S. enforcement officials that if a company has a program in place, it'll choose to go after the individuals responsible and not the company itself. Let's look at specific allegations related to the Dominican Republic and Embraer's business there. The allegation is that 3.4 million in kickbacks was paid through 3 shell companies. That's how the money got back to the director of special projects at the Dominican military. It's been reported that those kickbacks were mischaracterized in Embraer's books as legitimate fees associated with sales activity in another public procurement relating to the government of Jordan, right? So that's what has been reported. Now, had Embraer had a compliance program in place, right, those kickbacks most likely would have been identified and this crisis would have been avoided before it started. How would those kickbacks have been identified? Well, it's standard to make sure that the service providers you're using are not shell companies, that they're actually providing legitimate services, right? And so how do companies do that? Well, they create approved vendor lists. And so there are systems in place to consider vendors when you're onboarding them, so that a number of different eyes at the company are looking at the vendor, so that you can establish that yes, the vendor is providing legitimate services. So you can establish that yes, there is a legitimate business need to bring on this new vendor. And then there are ways to analyze the transactions with that vendor over time. So, are payments to the vendor being made in a way that's somewhat consistent with what was originally budgeted? Are there, delegation or, are there segregation of duties with respect to onboarding that vendor and performing the business activities with that vendor? Are any red flags present, right, with respect to that vendor's activity? And so, to think that in a controlled environment like that, you could set up 3 shell companies related to a high-risk activity, in this case, public procurement in Jordan, and make payments to those shell companies and book them in a way, that is perceived as legitimate without uncovering any wrongdoing. It just doesn't seem conceivable. This is why companies have compliance programs in place. And just to add one last thought, Tom, for the blog FCPA Americas, I had the opportunity a few months back to spend time with and to interview a guy named Mark Whitaker. And you might recognize Mark Whitaker because they made a movie about him, and Matt Damon played him in the movie.
Right.
The movie was called The Informant. And Mark Whitaker was the famous whistleblower from ADM, who was a high-level executive and went undercover and recorded conversations over the span of several years and basically disclosed to the FBI a multi-billion-dollar price-fixing scheme. And one thing he talks a lot about when he talks about whistleblowers and internal reporting is that, cases like Enron, WorldCom, ADM, had there been an internal reporting mechanism in place and had it been publicized and had there been a culture of compliance, these crises wouldn't have been allowed to get to the place they got to, right? And so, look, we don't know what Embraer was doing back in that era, but there's a good chance that it did not have these mechanisms in place, because had it had these mechanisms in place, it wouldn't find itself 3 years into an internal investigation.
Well, Matt, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. If I could ask if anyone wants to contact you for follow-up information, could you tell them how to reach you?
Definitely, yeah. You can go to, the best place to find me is on the blog, FCPAmericas, all one word, .com. And you can email me at info@fcpaamericas.com, again, one word. And you can also find me I'm affiliated with Miller and Chevalier, and so you can visit the site of Miller and Chevalier and check out the bios of the attorneys there. And I look forward to helping anyone out or answering any questions. And again, Tom, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's always great visiting with you, and I love what you're doing with this series.
Okay, thanks a lot.